Good morning, everyone, good evening, everyone. It's morning here. This is a pre-record. It's going to go on at night. My bad. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. I am your host, Jason Miles, and since we are trying to record as many of these as possible to give you guys new, fresh content, while Pascal and Djene and Kuba and I take a little bit of a break, it'll be just me today. And I haven't done this in a very long time. I'm actually really excited because for those of you really long-time listeners, the before Pascal listeners, it used to be just me. And I used to do stuff like this. Super crazy. Like wake up really early in the morning, talk to someone that lives on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. Today we have a returning guest. I want to say returning guest because we don't know how we're going to air the episodes that she was on. So let's just say that this guest is an extended member of the TIR family, since she works very closely with Doug Lane and his new diet soap project. And as many of you know, or if you don't know, here's some information for you. Doug Lane will be airing his Critical Cuts videos every other Monday on This is Revolution's YouTube channel. And we will be contributors to Pop the Left. Pascal and Kuba are going to be helping co-host Pop the Left as well. So let me bring in our guest, Ashley Frawley. She is a senior lecturer in sociology and social policy at Swansea University and the author of The Semiotics of Happiness, Rhetorical Beginnings of a Public Company, which is what we're going to talk to her about today. Look, the idea. Yes. Please welcome Professor and Thor Guevara's doctoral advisor, Ashley Frawley. That's Stefan. The people on the show call Stefan Thor Guevara. They say he looks like Thor and like Che Guevara.
Well, hi. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for agreeing to come on. Excited for the show today. I was reading through your book, and my first, and also Djene had sent us some articles of yours for the past show that we had done, and reading through your book again a little bit, I'm like, man, what does this woman have against joy? Is this her emo phase just accentuated?
Well, funnily enough, I did used to like emo music back in the day. No, so yeah, I mean, if you read through the book, obviously you can tell that I don't have anything against joy. At least I hope you can tell that.
No, I know you don't. I'm giving you a hard time.
For me, I think the main issue is I'm not talking about, how everyday people, lay people kind of go about finding joy in their lives. That's not really what it's about, what my research focuses on. Instead, I'm interested in how happiness became singled out as this scientific, so supposedly scientific phenomenon about which lay people actually had little knowledge, and that was actually an area of expertise, that happiness was a science. And further, these claims that started to emerge they emerged much earlier, but they became very powerful at the beginning of the 2000s, where people started to say the fact that people don't know how to pursue happiness in the correct ways, they often get it wrong. In fact, some of these claims makers would say people are like hamsters in a treadmill, trying to find happiness in all the wrong places.
Well, I want to get into.
But just to finish that thought, the fact that people get it wrong explains so many social problems. So we can solve a range of social problems by reorienting people back to the true meaning of happiness as discovered by science. So it's that whole discourse that I really kind of take apart and try to explain where it came from and why it became powerful.
You write in your book, instead of taking for granted the importance of the issue, this book asks how and why the semiotics of happiness became an appealing and plausible means of communicating an increasing array of social issues. Its primary focus is not on happiness as an abstract, unchanging object that, once discovered, can be revealed for all people and all times, but rather as a set of clearly indefinable and consistently repeated claims about the nature of individuals. And when you bring up the early 2000s, the first thing I think of, and I don't know how much this resonated in your world, and I don't know where you were at the time, but if you were in Canada or in the UK, when The Secret was making the rounds, which was there was a book and a movie, and the movie was literally the book word for word. And I remember, this guy had to have been my late 20s, early 30s when this hit. And it also was kind of a bad time for the economy, because around this time is when the mortgage crisis is hitting. And I remember everybody was all about The Secret. You know, if you just think positive, putting things out into the universe, then you'll get everything you want. And if you don't have success, it's because you didn't wish hard enough, almost, when you read that book.
Yeah. So what's interesting about that is that there's a part of, you know, therapy culture, which is what I study and what other people in my sort of little academic niche study. We call it therapy culture, which is a sort of set of ideas about, you know, the nature of the world and human psychology and how things work. A part of that is things like The Secret, where if you just think positive, things will happen. And there's this, you know, you can see that in the 1980s, 1990s self-esteem, you know, fad that came about, where it was like, well, if you can like think positively about yourself somehow, some way, things will, you know, become better. You'll bring yourself wealth and happiness and so on. So there's a big part of that within therapy culture. But what's interesting about some of the things that I was studying is that actually most people probably didn't know very much about it. So when I kind of explain, like, didn't you know that happiness is a science and that it was this big thing that made headlines, that happiness is Britain's worst social problem, and that we should have a happiness index and we should measure happiness instead of wealth? Don't you know about that? And they would say, I never heard of that. And I say, exactly. This discourse became so powerful. It was really powerful in policymaking in the 2010s. And has been institutionalized into policy. That is, it's now measured, well-being is now measured, without people even knowing anything about it. And yet it was portrayed as this way of like reconnecting to people and with what really matters, and how policy is just about the cold language of numbers and money, and, oh, you don't want that. How do we make people happy? And yet it was the people whose job it was to crunch the cold numbers and to deal with money, and who had quite a lot of money themselves, who were claiming this. So it's interesting because it's a completely different discourse than the kind of thing, or at least it tries to portray itself as a completely different discourse, this happiness discourse that I studied, than something like The Secret or something like the self-esteem movement. And actually, a lot of the very first gurus of the happiness movement were critics of self-esteem. They had initially been supporters of it and even had written books about self-esteem. Someone like Martin Seligman, for instance, from the United States, who was the founder of something called positive psychology, the idea that psychologists should study happiness and well-being and positive emotions. He had written books about self-esteem as well. And then when he kind of becomes a harbinger of this new discourse, this new big idea, he positions himself as a critic of everything that came before. Oh, this old discourse, it's a panacea. It tries to solve everything, and therefore it solves nothing. Here's my new discourse, happiness, which will inoculate people from future social problems if only we could teach people the correct ways to pursue happiness. It was a very similar discourse, but it tries to disavow earlier what's seen as like unscientific views of emotion. And so this discourse actually is a really strong is a really strong attempt to be very much scientific, to disavow this kind of magical thinking, but it still has that kind of germ of magical thinking in it, that, you know, you still have this kind of quasi-religious experience where the guru stumbles upon the new discourse. You know, Seligman talks about how he's like in the garden and his daughter bounds up to him, Daddy, why don't you blah, blah? And then this was the moment that I realized that psychologists need to study happiness. And there's always this like moment. So there's a lot of magic within these discourses, but they have a really strong claim to science. They claim that a science as hard as nails proves that we have the true meaning of happiness here. We figured it out. Science has got it. All we need to do is go into schools, teach children how to truly be happy. Governments should promote these things that science claims proves will bring about happiness, and so on. And this will bring about happiness in the world, but also solve a range of problems.
And that's where it gets interesting to me. Would you call, and the, you know, all of this, the happiness industry, self-esteem, definitely the wellness and mindfulness industry, would you call it the neoliberalization of happiness?
It's difficult to say. Some aspects of it, of the discourse, are definitely neoliberal, but it's not neoliberal in the sense of like a reactivation of liberal ideas of the human subject, like as self-governing and capable of freedom and things like that. No, the vision of the human subject that's put forward is very much a vulnerable subject. The people are just unable to adequately manage their own emotional lives, and this inability leads them to a wide range of problems. So that's the kind of that's the kind of story that they tell about social issues, is that there's something going on in people's heads that's incorrect. And if we can go in and fix the way the people are, then they will be able to, well, they won't be the source of problems anymore. Let me give you an example of this. So within this happiness discourse, one of the big claims was money doesn't make you happy. That science proves money doesn't make you happy. And therefore, why do we have all this wealth seeking? If not to make you happy. So we just have to go in and kind of like dampen down this desire for more wealth within individuals, and we'll solve all these social problems. So you'd think like a discourse that appears to have a distaste for wealth would be disproven when 2008 comes around and we have the financial crash and people are like losing everything. No, they claim to be vindicated. They were like, see, look, if only people had realized that they wouldn't find happiness in these big houses, and if bankers didn't think they'd find happiness in X, then we wouldn't have crises. And that's a nice story, right? It makes a good headline, but it's incredibly stupid because like I mean, we have cyclical crises every 10, 15 years within capitalism. It's not just people like accidentally looking for happiness in the wrong places. You are compelled to do things within capitalism. There's a system that pushes your hand. But what it does is it tells this very nice, simplistic kind of story about the causes and solution to social problems. And they are rooted in the human mind, that human beings are just weak. And if we can go in and like shore them up and make them stronger, make them behave correctly by getting them to manage their emotions correctly, then we won't have these problems anymore. So there is a kind of neoliberal aspect to that, in the sense of like, we are trying to get people to self-govern in a way, but they don't actually trust people to be able to self-govern, because they see that inability as being at the heart of social problems. So they can't just leave people to it, because they think that people are the cause of problems. It's in our head rather than in the system.
But isn't that, in my opinion, isn't that kind of the problem with this way of looking at the world? Because as you see these major social issues, so let's just go in the Wayback Machine to like 2008, 2009. Mm-hmm. You bought your McMansion on some sort of stated income, stated asset loan, mm-hmm. or an adjustable rate mortgage. You initially walked in the door with equity and, you know, possibly refinanced right away, and now you're underwater in your house. You're on the verge of losing everything, and you fall down a rabbit hole of mindfulness books and And the secret thinking, right? Magical thinking, let's just call it that. And you start to see the world in the same light, where it's just greedy people, and it's not systems. It's not capitalism that's your problem. It's just greedy people. That seems very problematic to me. And that's one of the reasons why I really hate the mindfulness, the industry. I mean, mindfulness is a real thing. It's part of the was it the Eightfold Path in Buddhism, and it takes years to achieve these things. But these books tell us that we can do it overnight.
I'm really reluctant to. Sorry, something going on in my hair here. I'm really reluctant to blame individuals for this kind of thing. Like, I don't think that people necessarily have to believe it. I don't think the problem comes from people believing this. Yes, some people do. Certainly, some people are totally oblivious of it. Oblivious to it. It's the public discourse that I'm interested in, and the way that it invites a particular view of social problems. And what I'm saying is, I'm trying to invite a different view of social problems. And the way that it becomes powerful is when employers use it, for example, or when governments use it to deflect attention from other issues. So that whole oh, money doesn't buy you happiness thing. What I think is really interesting about that is that I think that, so this came from happiness economists, so-called happiness economists, who claim to have done, well, they did these studies, and they kept doing this and rolling out all these graphs all over the place, where they showed, economic growth rising like this, and, or incomes or some other monetary indicator, and then happiness surveys from about the 1940s showing how the percentage of very happy people, and the line is straight. And it's like, oh, look, in spite of all this economic growth, we're no happier. And it's like this idea, you shouldn't want more, just be happy with the way things are. But of course, they don't put anything else on that graph. I don't know, the discovery of the NHS, female equality. And it's like, oh, well, ladies, back to your kitchen. Nobody says that. And so what I think they're actually doing is, I think that these economists and the people who buy into, policymakers who bought into this discourse that we should deflect attention away from economic growth, they were observing something real in the world, and it had nothing to do with happiness. What they were observing is that economic growth is struggling. Yeah, so on that graph, you can see the number go up. But if we look at monetary indicators over the last 200 years, the long-term rate of profit has been declining. Economic growth has been stumbling along. They're having a lot of trouble. Growth liberalism is in crisis. And so it's natural for them to want to downplay this. And it goes back to the 19th century with John Stuart Mill. He also noticed that capitalism has this tendency towards stagnation. But because he saw capitalism as pretty much the end of history, this is it, he said, he tried to harmonize it. Oh, look, it's this harmonious stationary state to which capitalism is naturally tending. And I think this is what people are doing now. They see that there's this stagnation in capitalism, and they see people stubbornly wanting more. And they're like, well, you can't. And why should you? It won't make you happy. And the whole, mainstream economics says that the reason why everything exists is because we're just pursuing our utility, basically. So it fits with that. Well, if things are going wrong, or if human beings are out of touch with their system, and the system is stagnating, but people don't want to stagnate, well, there must be something wrong with people, not something wrong with the system. So I think they're explaining something real in the world, and it has an effect on policy, where they are actually trying to redirect our attention away from this stagnation in capitalism. And you can see it it was actually this whole idea that we should promote happiness rather than growth or income or something like that is something very powerful in developing countries. And it was powerful in developing countries before it was powerful in Western countries, because growth liberalism wasn't happening there. They abandoned economic growth because all of their policies that were supposed to bring the whole world up to this wonderful consumer civilization, it wasn't happening. And so it makes sense to say, well, maybe we should measure things differently. So that's what I'm interested in. It's what are people actually trying to explain in the world? And when it comes to everyday people who are sitting in their McMansions or whatever, well, yeah, of course you're going to start thinking about magical solutions because your life is crap and you feel totally disempowered.
Yeah.
And that one good thing that you had, capitalism told you, yeah, we're going to give you a better life. This is the right system for you. And then it all goes to crap. And you're like, how dare you think that capitalism will give you a better life? It's your fault that this whole system came down. Well, people can't do anything right. And you're atomized. There's no working class movement. I understand why people might turn to magical solutions to their problems. I feel empathy for that. I'm not criticizing people for that. My interest is more in terms of policymakers and the sort of bigger picture of things, of what is this discourse attempting to explain, and how is it being used by various groups in society?
Now, happiness discourse in the workplace, which I find very interesting. I did some contract work in tech. I've always felt like the bigger companies, the Facebooks, the Twitters, LinkedIn. I don't know if you've ever been in those office spaces, but they're kind of like workplace Disneylands. Your job here is the happiest place on earth. Look at all the fun things we get to do. There's a micro kitchen on every floor, sleep pods, music rooms. We want you to work around the clock on a salary with no OT, but I mean, look how happy you are.
Yeah, I mean, definitely that pushing, that lengthening of the working day has been recast as a benefit to your health, your health and well-being. Especially during like lockdowns. My workload tripled during lockdown, which was already really high, and it tripled, and I had to take care of kids. And so it was like, oh, don't worry, we'll be flexible, So flexible meant I could work from 8 till 4 a.m. Right now. Just not anything anybody wants, right? Yeah. But this predates COVID-19, this idea of like rehashing flexible work, which was like recasting all these things that trade unions had fought against for a really long time as flexible work.
But you're in academia, and it's a little different. My ex worked in medical research, so it's you get a gift, an appreciation. So it's like, hey, we know that you haven't been sleeping as you're doing a ridiculous amount of work, but we sent you a mug and a really nice fleece pullover, and we're going to give you $40 in so you can order food. Lunch is on us. There you go.
Yeah, and there's also like more insidious uses of these. I should probably explain what I mean by like happiness discourses. So it was like people who, the thing that I was studying was this kind of like scientized happiness movement that emerged in about 2003 in a big way in the UK and reached its apex in about 2012. It then kind of morphed into well-being, and now it's become mental health. But the happiness thing was up until 2012. But it's like, books like The How of Happiness, The Happiness Hypothesis, all these very sciencey, but also kind of Eastern. They all have
an Eastern influence. Yes.
Yeah, a lot of these discourse. My new book that I've been working on for ages. I'm gonna finish it soon, I swear.
It's called Leave Yoga Alone.
I won't leave yoga alone. No, I look at self-esteem, happiness, well-being, mindfulness, and mental health. And they all have these same kind of things. They all have a very strong claim to science, but they also have this kind of magic to them. They have a quasi-spiritual side. They have gurus, but they also have like legions of less qualified people who are just selling all kinds of like meditation apps and 10 minutes online or, things like that. So it's like books and tapes and websites and policy advisory positions, and even positions that they've managed to lobby for in lots of different institutions and employment. So you have like chief happiness officers, for example. And all of them are.
What does that person do? The chief happiness officer. What is their job? Is it a lot of tickling involved?
Well, there was actually one of the funniest things that I saw advertised when I was doing my research was a laughter facilitation specialist.
The hell does that person do?
You could pay somebody to come into your workplace and give a laughter facilitation specialist, and people would be like, ha ha ha.
Wait. Time out.
Totally ridiculous. Like they're more and less ridiculous things, but that was one of the more ridiculous things.
We have to have your time out. We have to stop for a second. I know time is limited, but I need you to kind of explain this more. So some giggle guts is going to come into your office place and tickle everyone?
No, because that would be kind of problematic, right? You can't.
We've okayed this with HR, everybody.
Everyone's like, oh, uncomfortable but trying to hide it. No, no, I if I had been doing an ethnography, which is where you like do participant observation, I would have loved to have written a paper about that particular thing and see what they do. I did go to a number of like well-being facilitation seminars that were offered at various places. And then I went to some that were offered at my current workplace, shouldn't probably mention. But it was like, you've got this really high workload. And then you've got well-being Wednesdays where you all go into this room for an hour and close your eyes and feel totally ridiculous and kind of open your eyes a little bit and like try to clear your mind of stress. And it's like, no, I need decent childcare and I need my workload lowered and I need you to hire more people, you cheapskate. That's what But that's the thing. That's what's so insidious about some of these things, is that they allow people to make this claim that we care about your well-being within a context that, of course, is forced by, they might be, I'm not saying bosses are like greedy or something like that. They have to make a profit in order to compete. And so the system itself is forcing a lengthening of the working day and an intensification of labor. And they can't really do much about that. And workers, instead of fighting back, are encouraged to think that the problem is actually in their heads, and it's just their inability to find time to breathe or whatever, and go for a walk and smell the fresh air, as opposed to it being a labor issue. And luckily, of course, workers are not really fooled most of the time. You're in one of these things and everybody's kind of looking at each other like, yeah, well, this doesn't really reduce my workload, does it? And so people still do band together and fight for a better deal. But it's an attempt to say, like, oh, no, actually, we care about your well-being and we care so much. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to give you an extra well-being 5 minutes a day and here's how to breathe. And we have this specialist come in and so on. And, there's a whole industry side of this as well, of people who set themselves up as these specialists, these well-being mentors and so on. And I suppose they're able to, I know, they sell this expertise on the basis of like, we will help your workers to self-govern. We will help your workers to not be quite so ill. We will help your workers to not go off on stress leave by, these deceptively simple meditation tips and so on. So there's a huge part of that, of all these experts who set themselves up that way. But here's the trick. It doesn't actually do what it says on the tin. So the idea is that it's supposed to shore you up. It's supposed to stop you from wanting expensive time off or expensive services and so on. But what it does is it encourages you to believe or to focus on yourself quite a lot.
Yes.
And when you do that, you pretty much always find it wanting. And that's the contradiction that's kind of built into these discourses, is that they sell themselves to businesses, to governments, on the basis of being able to create a neoliberal subject. That is a subject that self-governs and is cheap and doesn't require services and so on. And is, tough and able to withstand basically their exploitation or whatever. But the end result is actually the opposite, because you would go out of business if you didn't, right? They have to create a need first for what they're selling. And by creating that need, you create a sense of a lack. You create a lack in people. So it's very interesting. The very first claims that emerge in each one of these discourses that I just mentioned, they're not responding to anything. They are selling the existence of their thing as a science, as something. They sell the solution. They're like a hammer looking for a nail. And then they find problems that they claim they can solve. But the very first claim is like, why aren't more people using this? That's the problem. More people aren't calling on our services. And so they sell themselves, but they have to create like, well, people don't know how to find happiness. without me. And people are doing it wrong, and that's what's causing your problem. Or people's minds are so disordered and they need mindfulness, and it's such a simple thing. But you have to create that need first. And so you actually create a vulnerability in people. And so it creates this engine of ever rising demand for all of these different well-being and self-help things and so on. And businesses are interested in it because it claims at least to bring down work-related stress and so on, but actually it doesn't. The more
it challenge power.
No, it's you have an upward spiral in demand. It actually creates more demand.
Approaching happiness as a social problem can proceed from two perspectives. The first could be considered an objectivist or realist orientation and reflects the vast majority of research and claims about happiness flooding university lecture halls and newspaper column inches. The happiness index is a news story, usually a headline story.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the happiest place on earth, I think this year was Finland.
No, there's a ton of indices, and the more that you look into them, the more you see their little ideological bases. Some of them are funny. So the way that they ask questions sometimes leads to a particular result. How they gather data, sometimes they don't even ask particular countries, because how are you going to go like deliver a survey in Vanuatu, for example? You don't. And so you have like and then you have, of course, like feeling rules in particular countries. So different countries have different cultural rules around how you express discontent and whether or not you should. And, you know, when you say, how are you? Is it acceptable to say how you actually are? Or is it a formulaic question where you're supposed to say, fine, thanks? Every culture has different things about this. So there's a lot of controversy about what those indices actually say. But a lot of them are basically ways of saying this thing that I want is good. So there's one that's because happiness has become like a cultural way of saying this is good. If it could, and not anymore, not happiness, more like well-being and health and mental health. That's what it's become now. So why is this good? Because it's good for your mental health. Why is this good? Because it supports your well-being or whatever. Because we don't have any other kind of moral vocabulary left in our pluralistic societies. We now use this kind of scientized, psychologized vocabulary. But one of my favorite surveys was one that put out by Friends of the Earth, which was, and they'd come out every year with like, the happiest country in the world is Vanuatu. The happiest country is Costa Rica. The happiest country is this. And people go, and then they'd have news report, send out a press release, and the news reporters would go around asking people questions. Why do you think Vanuatu is the happiest country in the world? And people go, well, because they live a simple life there, and people wearing grass skirts, and it just affirms all of these romanticized ideas of the other and so on. But actually, they never actually asked anybody in these countries. They defined happiness in very underhanded ways that were equated with having a small ecological footprint, because the whole point was to say that you didn't need economic development in order to be happy.
Wow.
But very, very few people actually looked at what the surveys said, what the actual survey said, and the fact that they had brought in just data when they couldn't reach people. They just used the World Values Surveys. So they extrapolated, which means they made stuff up basically. But that, it was to put forward an agenda. And that's what that discourse became. If you could just link your particular thing to happiness and now to well-being or to mental health, you were more likely to get a headline. You were more likely for policymakers to listen to you. And it's the same thing now. Everybody and their brother is scrambling to figure out, like, how do I frame my issue as good for mental health? How do I frame my issue as good for well-being? And some governments have even mandated it. So Australia, with their whole well-being policy, they're like, oh, you have to show, if you want something, you have to show how it contributes to well-being. So all these people who wanted they got projects ongoing for like 10 years. They're like sitting there trying to think, this will promote well-being because, and just pulling stuff. It just became this way of saying my thing is good when there's no other language to do that. You can't say because it's going to make people richer. We don't believe in that anymore. There's very little you can say. Okay, well, it's good for your mental health then.
Well, and that's an interesting part of the discourse, because as I'm writing notes, this seems like a real bourgeois PMC discourse because it kind of sits in a certain space. When you agree, like if you go to Amazon, I don't know if the workers are like, hey, time out, guys. Everybody needs a mental health day. We know you've been peeing in bottles and that's been stressing you out. And it's the holiday season and we're not letting anyone have a day off. But we're going to have an hour for Mindfulness Wednesdays. This stuff kind of sits in a certain place. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And the argument that I make in the book is that it's a form of romantic anti-capitalism. So the discourse appears to put forward a criticism of capitalism, but of course it doesn't understand what capitalism is. It sees capitalism as consumerism. So it's like, oh, we'll just stop people from consuming. And it sees capitalism as economic growth. So if we have less growth, we have less capitalism. No, because I'm sorry, the 1930s, that's capitalism. Like capitalism isn't just people like enjoying themselves, and it wouldn't be a problem if that's what capitalism was. So they have this like very basic understanding of capitalism, which is very much mainstream bourgeois economics understanding. You know, people, this system exists because we demand it in the market, because we are consumers, and if there's a problem, we're demanding the wrong things. So you just have to make people demand the right things, and everything will go away. But also, there's something in this kind of desire to move beyond the cold rationalism of numbers, of money, and so on, and seek some sort of deeper meaning. This goes way, way back to the 19th century reaction to the Enlightenment. And there are also aspects of utopian socialism within it. So a lot of these discourses claim to have discovered, true human nature. That's what they think they're describing. Human nature says it needs these things to be happy. And so we just create a society that best attunes with human nature. I mean, that's what the utopian socialists said. But Marxists had disagreed and had criticized utopian socialism. And one of these, Plekhanov, had said, if it were the case that we could just find, what true human nature and then create the perfect social organization that best attunes with human nature, then we're stuck for understanding why there are so many different societies in the world, and human beings have existed in so many, coexisted in so many different ways. And so he says, I'm going to misquote this, but basically he says, either human nature does not change, and then it explains nothing in history, which shows us many different ways of human beings organizing their lives, or it does change, and then it is the outcome and not the cause of human social evolution. That is, our human nature changes. As we change the world, we change ourselves. So what we're going to find happiness in the future is going to be different than how we find happiness now. So this whole like bourgeois idea of like, oh, we'll just find the perfect social organization, we'll just tinker with things and we'll sort things out, is not true. And it deflects attention from the deeper problems within the system itself. It also puts forward a very stagnant and static vision of what it means to be human. This is it. This is all there is. And our society is simply a reflection of our human nature. So if there's something bad in society, it's simply because of our bad human nature. And now you can go in and try to fix people a little bit and tinker here and there, but there's no point in changing things in any fundamental way, because we'll just simply reproduce the same things again and again and again. But also, so this kind of like romantic idea of capitalism is a big part of it. That, you criticize consumerism, you criticize economic growth, and you long for a return to some idealized past, usually in like Asia or in a lot of the examples that people would bring out in my research when I was looking at articles, they talk about Ladakh, Buddhist places, this Shangri-La and so on, without mentioning that they're feudal throwbacks. So they're actually literally talking about a feudal society as this wonderful, beautiful place that we should all emulate. And Marx called this capitalism's legitimate antithesis. Romanticism is capitalism's legitimate antithesis, which means that it appears to criticize capitalism, and therefore it's accepted and widely held within capitalism. But it actually sustains and justifies capitalism.
Well, I know we're coming up on our time right now, but I think you hit on something that's very, very interesting. Right now, as we're seeing in real time, for those that didn't want to see it, the errors of capitalism with COVID, right? Especially here in the States with a privatized healthcare system, huge issues with housing, and there's all these anti-capitalist movies that are extremely popular. One of the most popular shows here in the States, I can't speak for where you're at in the UK, is Squid Games.
Yeah.
On Netflix. You have Parasite, which won an Academy Award here for Best Picture. It was the first foreign director to win one, I believe, and or at least Korean. And The Joker, which is a very anti-neoliberal, you could say anti-capitalist movie. There, Joaquin Phoenix won Best Director. Nomadland, which you can have issues with the movie, but ultimately the book is an extremely anti-capitalist book. So that's interesting that you say that, because all these things are accepted on a huge mainstream pop culture level, to the point where here I live in Mexico and they even sell like the Squid Games masks here in Mexico, like street vendors sell them. It's so popular. So how can anti-capitalism be so popular? But, to your point, that's very, very fascinating.
Yeah, because the ideology of capitalism is its anti-ideology. Like the thing that sustains capitalism is things like anti-consumerism, because capitalists don't want you to be consumerist. Like your boss wants to cheapen your cost of living as much as possible. That's why you get all this cheap stuff from China that cheapens your cost of living. They don't have to pay you so much. And this goes back to like debates about the price of bread in the 19th century. It looked like capitalists were on your side by saying, yeah, the price of bread is too high. But the reason is because if they could lower the price of bread, they wouldn't have to pay you so much. And you'd be happy with less. Capitalists don't want their own workers to be profligate. They want workers of other countries to be profligate. They want them to spend their money. They want you to be a nice little Protestant and find your meaning somewhere else and not ask for more. And like during a crisis, you better not ask for more because you're not getting any more. Or like during a strike, what do I ask for? Well-being Wednesdays? No, I want more money. That's what I'm asking for. Capitalism does create enormous amounts of wealth, but the contradiction is when it does that, it undermines its ability to create a profit. It's less and less able to make sufficient profit from the wealth produced. So it has to invest more and more and more to get less and less profit. It's a problem within capitalism. It's described even in the very basic texts of Marxism, like the Communist Manifesto, when Marx and Engels write that the capitalist is like a sorcerer who's unable to control the powers that he's conjured up from the netherworld. That capitalism at a certain point becomes a fetter on the production of wealth. It undermines the source of its own wealth production. And we've been led astray from this since about the 1960s, where we started to the post-war boom made a lot of leftists start to think that the problem with capitalism is that it creates too much. Go back to the 1930s and nobody's going to say that, because you recognize during a crisis, even though you have a world of wealth, which is crazy, you have so much and yet people can't eat it. You can't have it. If you look at like John Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath, he has all these wonderful, horrible little vignettes of like the people are starving. They're literally starving and they're pouring lye on pigs and they're burning the food. That's what capitalism does. It creates enormous wealth, but it tells you can't have it. So a lot of these discourses, they appear to be anti-capitalist only if you think that capitalism, the bad thing about capitalism is that it makes you too wealthy. Like,
yeah.
The bad thing about capitalism is that it gives you the possibility of wealth, but then it says you can't have it. The McMansions, for instance, here you go. You can have the same comfort that your boss has. You can live in your dream home. And then you have a crisis and it's like, how dare you think you could have that? Here, it's mine now. And it's your fault.
Yeah. That was the narrative. That's still the narrative. Over 10 years later, that's still the narrative that we hear about this. And I see that you're very passionate, as am I, about this issue.
Yeah, I mean, because like I grew up in in poverty. Like my dream, what I wanted was like I would go to other people's houses, and I remember they had like fluffy carpets and pictures on the
And
wall.
we should, before you finish, you grew up on the res, right?
No, I didn't. I didn't grow up on a reservation. No. I only went there for the summers and that sort of thing. And actually, my memories of the reservation are my fondest memories. I had a lovely time because for me, it was just a place where I went to go see family. But no, I was just like my brother had, I shouldn't out my family. Anyways, there's all sorts of very difficult things that we went through. Anyways, and I just wanted like these very basic things that would make my life comfortable and that would make things easier for me. And when everything was so difficult, everything is still difficult. Like I couldn't get anywhere because I didn't have a car and I never got my license and I was all by myself and I had to do every damn thing for myself. And how much I desired and longed for what those people had. And I saw it there in front of me, just so close. Mm-hmm. And it hurt so bad that you can't have it. And what these discourses tell you to do is that it's that pain that's the problem.
Yes.
How dare you want more? See how bad it is for your mental health? And I've even seen like the New Economics Foundation misquote Marx. So in Wage, Labor, and Capital, he has this line where he says, a house may be large or small, but as long as the Marx, by the way, as long as the surrounding houses are likewise small, it satisfies all requirements for a residence. But let there arise next to the house a castle, and the little house shrinks to a hut. And people say, see, we're never happy with what we have. Can you imagine Karl Marx telling you not to envy what the ruling class has? You should be happy with your little hut. No, you built that castle. Go and take it. It's yours. That's what human beings are capable of at the moment. We're capable of living in castles, and you live in a hut. That's wrong. Mm-hmm. That's an injustice, and you should fight so that everyone can have a castle.
And this is, I wish we could talk longer, but I know that you're stressed for time. But that's where it gets interesting. We did a show, and somehow PMC Discourse came into the show, and someone had asked a question along the lines of, well, what is it going to take for this class of people to try to join into these working class movements and strikes? And I was like, I don't know, man. I was like, I've been in those tech spaces, and people really drink the happiness Kool-Aid because that's literally all you get fed. All you get fed is that everyone here is happy. And if you're not happy, you become a problem to the point where you have to fake happiness.
Yes. Yeah.
So to keep your job. Mm-hmm. So it's really hard, I think, for them to, collectively to want to get together and start asking for something different. Like you said, more money. Because you're fooled by, again, the micro kitchens and, they gave me a brand new computer on command. I didn't like the one I had because the screen wasn't big enough. And here they gave me, it's theirs. They can take it. They're literally monitoring me from it. They can take it from me whenever they want, but they told me it was mine.
Yeah, and well, I can also understand that too, because you're fearful of losing that. You know that you've got it bad, but other people have it worse. And you don't want to get tossed down there. And this is the problem too. Like when you have to have like a big movement, often you need to have multi-class people. Like you need to have all sorts of people who are pissed off at capital to come together. But the problem with that, and this has happened historically, is that in order to have a big thing that can change things, everybody has to come together. But all those people have different needs and desires, and they're in it for different reasons. They have different class interests. And so you have to be very careful that, yes, you can band together for a short period of time, but you can't let people whose main desire is not to be tossed down into the working class lead the movement, because their goal is just to shore up their position, not to emancipate labor, for example.
Well, I know we are coming up on our time. I'm sure people are very fired up from this very fiery talk given by Dr. Ashley Frawley. Now you see why Thor Guevara, aka Stefan, is a part of our show, because Ashley is Thor's teacher.
I am. PhD supervisor.
PhD supervisor. And if you see Stefan, please tell him I said what's up and give him a hug for me, because I really, really appreciate that kid. I think Stefan's a wonderful person and a great addition to the show.
Yeah, Thor, is that what you said? You call
Thor Guevara. So Thor, the Norse god, and Che Guevara. They call him a combination.
Well, Thor is going to write a really good book at the end of it, I'm sure. So
I'm very excited for that. Just a great kid. I really appreciate Stefan and all the youthful energy he brings to us old guys on the show. So thank you, Ashley. The book is, I want to get the title right, The Semiotics of Happiness, Rhetorical Beginnings of a Public Problem. You can follow her at Ashley A. Frawley on Twitter. Thank you for spending some time with me today. And we are out.